When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Polish army wasn't ready to respond, and with the Soviet Union joining in 17 days later, the Polish fate was sealed and they capitulated in 35 days. But what if Poland managed to survive the year of 1939, fighting until the beginning of 1940 and delaying their collapse by a couple of months? Since the Second World War was based on timing, this likely would delay the fall of France, which would delay the North African campaign, the consolidation of the Balkans, and most importantly Operation Barbarossa. As a result of that, had Poland survived for longer, the Second World War could have played out much more differently, as the Axis would have been noticeably weaker. Let me show you what I came up with. First up, if we want Poland to stand a chance, we first need to learn what caused their downfall in our own history. Now, many believe that the Polish army was severely lacking in modern equipment and was poorly trained. One famous example is this of the Polish at Krojanty, where Polish cavalry charged the German tanks in the field of battle. Not only is this just one example, but it's also not true. This was merely a story created by a journalist after putting together a bunch of incorrect information. The actual incident was that a handful of German soldiers had gotten attacked by the Polish cavalry, and German tanks arrived shortly afterwards, forcing the Polish back, creating the narrative that the Polish had charged their tanks with their cavalry. In reality, the Polish army was much stronger than many people make it seem to be, and while it wasn't the most modern military in the history of the world, it could have definitely put up a fight if we change a few key things. First off, we need the German High Command to worry more about the French, as they kind of ignored them and went all in on Poland. Historically, the Germans put the bulk of their army on the Polish front, with really only garrison divisions defending against France. I think that you know the story of how France managed to take the Saarland, stole a few bikes and then went behind the Maginot Line. Had France went all in against Germany, the Second World War could have looked really differently, but I'm not going to do this option, as it ignores why France never did it in the first place, and it deserves another video. Now this gamble for Germany actually paid off, but what if we have the Germans worry more about the French invasion? We could see them divert a few tens of thousands of soldiers over to this front, limiting how many troops the Poles would have to fight, and in turn bolstering their odds to survive the year of 1939. Another change we can make is simple: Poland mobilizing sooner. Poland historically wanted this, but they were held back by the French and British. Why, do you may ask? Well, this was to not antagonize the Germans. Looking back at it, Germany were already very much antagonized, and nothing could unantagonize them. I suggest that Poland decides to mobilize themselves, starting early 1939, and doing it in secret, so Germany cannot use this as a means for propaganda. It would take slightly longer, but it would help the Poles much more. This allows more Polish troops to be trained, more arms to be produced, and lastly more deals to be made. Now the Polish army was behind in terms of technology and lacked significant modern aircraft and tanks. The Polish were actually really good pilots, helping turn the tides of the Battle of Britain. In fact, Polish pilots made up 5% of the pilots of the Royal Air Force, but accounted for about 12% of the enemy kills. This is after the capitulation of Poland, by the way, so this just goes to show you how useful the Polish soldiers actually were, even after their nation was partitioned once again. Next up, we can have Stalin to be much more hesitant about the invasion of Poland, as we cannot have the Poles to survive 1939 if the Soviet Union also invades them as well. This is due to the fact that in this alternate history, Polish troops would be holding off the Germans much better, and Stalin wouldn't want to suffer unnecessary casualties. This I think is not too impossible. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was already signed, and Stalin may prefer to let the Germans bleed for a little longer, but I think this is also unrealistic. The Soviet Union saw Germany as a potential ally in 1939, rather than as an enemy, as both had shared goals. I want to state that Poland's position in 1939 was just unsavable. They were abandoned by their Western allies and partitioned between their two larger and more powerful neighbors. So, if we want to make Poland hold out for a little longer, then I'm going to have to make some great changes, at the expense of a lot of realism, of course. The last change I'm going to make isn't going to help Poland too much in the war itself, but more so in escaping it. Poland historically demanded that Lithuania re-establish diplomatic relations between the two nations, which was severed partially due to a border incident. Lithuania accepted this in 1938, but no progress towards friendship was made before the outbreak of the war. I suggest that Poland and Lithuania manage to smooth out their relations at least a little sooner, which would allow for the Polish army to flee to Lithuania and eventually make their way to the United Kingdom. Historically, Polish soldiers escaped mostly from the south, where through Hungarian-occupied Carpathian Ruthenia they went to Romania and later to France. This left the Polish soldiers in the north isolated, as they had to surrender once the situation was dire enough. If this border dispute is resolved a few years sooner, we could see tens of thousands of extra Polish soldiers to escape, and we already know how they performed after the Polish capitulated. As to how we get this, historically after Germany annexed Memel from Lithuania, the Poles demanded that the two nations re-establish diplomatic relations, which were broken around 1920, when Poland didn't hand over Vilnius to Lithuania, which they claimed as their capital city, in the interwar period. So, if Germany annexes Memel slightly sooner than historically, then it would result in Poland and Lithuania to be slightly better off, but of course Lithuania allowing Polish soldiers to escape could result them in being invaded by Germany, hence why I don't think that this is too realistic, and perhaps this could be more unrealistic than Stalin not invading Poland, so keep this in mind. Latvia was a good friend of Poland, one of the only friendly nations in the interwar period, so perhaps more Polish soldiers could escape from there as well. As I said, this change is rather unrealistic however, and if you don't think that it's possible, then you can go ahead and disregard it. Now, with all the nitty-gritty out of the way, we can get to see the funny Bulgarian nationalist man paint funny lines on map part of the video. I know you're all here for, so let's get into it. The invasion of Poland would start as historically, with Operation Fall-Wise being launched on the 1st of September 1939. The Poles, now with a mobilized army as well as better means to resist, now would do so fearlessly. The strategy used by the Polish would most likely be one of decentralized defense, using ambush, hit and run tactics in terrain to their advantage. Important battles like the Battle of Mokra and the Battle of Bzura would see greater coordination on the side of the Polish, inflicting heavier German losses. By the 7th of September, the Germans would have still managed to reach Warsaw, but their troops would be much more battered and undersupplied, with the Polish possibly using scorcher tactics as well. At this point, the Polish government would flee to Lviv before the German bombardments damaged their escape routes, allowing the fighting to continue for a little bit longer. At this point, the German High Command would be furious, with Hitler probably ordering more troops from the French fronts to be sent to Poland, as to make them surrender quicker. Now with the sudden retreat of German forces on the Western Front, the French might go for an attack into the Rhine like historically, but even if they do, they would most likely be abandoned by the French High Command before it does any serious damage. No matter what, we will see panic in the German army, as the soldiers that were just sent away from the Western Front would now be rushed back to defend it. On the 17th of September, Stalin would continue to wait for the German advances into Poland, worried about whether an invasion would be worth it or not. Warsaw holds out until October the 5th in this alternate history, with the Germans taking the powerful rebel that would be the city. Polish snipers and other resistance groups would be prevalent there, harassing the German supply lines and reinforcements as they would arrive. Another Polish defensive line would be set up in the southeast near Lviv and the Carpathian foothills, along with portions of the Polish armies doing a controlled retreat towards Lithuania. Britain and France would use this time to supply the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war. Anyone who got this joke is a real one. Germany would shift most of their forces towards the southeast, wanting to take Lviv. In November, the Germans finally managed to reach the city, but wouldn't be able to capture it right away until mid-December, due to more supply issues and the local resistance, plus constant pressure from the west. The remnants of the Polish army in the southeast would continue to fight a mobile retreat through the Carpathians, fleeing into Hungary and Romania before slowly finding their way to Turkey and then the North African front. This would be important later. Finally, the Soviets would decide to join this conflict, citing the protection of the Eastern Slavs as a cause of their invasion. In reality, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had divided Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union, and now the Germans were occupying territories meant for the Soviet Union, as Lviv, Bialystok and Brest-Litovsk. The Soviets would decide to invade the rest of Poland as to secure these territories and force the hand of Germany to honor the pact. Britain and France wouldn't do anything to stop the Soviet Union from doing this, much like historically. Polish troops would manage to fortify Vilna and Bialystok before the Soviets arrive. However, Poland cannot hold up this fight for long, and eventually they would surrender in February, let's say the 15th, 1940. Poland historically survived the German and Soviet invasion for 35 days, but now with some unrealistic changes that we have made, it would be 167 days instead, almost 5 times longer than our history. Now this alternate surrender would see a few different results than historically. First up, more Polish troops would manage to be evacuated, eventually making it to North Africa or Britain. Not only that, but conflict would erupt between Hitler and Stalin over the Soviet occupation in the division of Poland, with Germany eventually refusing to cede Bialystok, as Germany had a lot more soldiers there, plus did the majority of the fighting, and would be wishing to divide Poland according to effort, which would favor them. Vilna would still go to Lithuania, and Polish troops would use these events to flee through the Lithuanian port. With Poland now occupied, at least on paper, the German High Command would immediately swing their forces to striking west, needing to make up for the lost time. At this point, France and Britain would be near to fully mobilized. Allied morale would be hardened historically, seeing the continued Polish resistance. Still, no offensive action would be taken by either side in early 1940, putting us in a similar phony war. Operation Falgelb would be delayed further, as Operation Vesirubung still needs to be carried out as to secure the Swedish iron. This operation would be much more vital for Germany and much more difficult than historically. Now, you see, with the prolonged invasion of Poland, the British would still mine the Norwegian coast, causing the Swedish iron trade to almost completely stop. This would begin to damage the German war machine, and by the time of April comes around, the time of this Operation Vesirubung, Germany would start to feel the effects of this. Denmark would still fall, but I would give them a day instead of 6 hours, so I'm feeling generous. Norwegian resistance would be much more firm, with possibly Polish forces fighting there as well. Of course, this invasion was very poorly managed by the British and French, and I doubt it would be improved by much in this timeline. Narvik and the rest of Norway would still fall to Germany, but a bit later, this time in July or August, as compared to June of our own history. During this, Hitler would demand the Operation Falgelb be executed sooner than planned, wanting to make up for the lost time. July 20th would be when this plan would be executed, later than historically, as by this time France had almost fallen, while Germany here is just getting started. Belgium and Luxembourg would fall quickly, with the Netherlands flooding their country and hiding in Amsterdam for a few weeks, before the Wehrmacht managed to fully capitulate the country. France and Britain would be much more prepared, but there isn't really a way for them to be able to expect a German invasion through the dense forest, still leading to Dunkirk to be executed. However, with a more prepared allies, more troops would be evacuated there, which would be a huge win for the British. Paris would still fall around early August, with France surrendering soon after. Now, with France being more prepared, however, the French Navy and portions of their armed forces would manage to escape and take the British, instead of, getting blown up by the British like historically. Oh, and Italy would also be here, I guess. All jokes aside, the Italians would probably wait even longer than historically to join the Second World War. The reason why is simple. Mussolini wanted to know that Germany could win this conflict before thrusting an underprepared Italy into the war. Now, with the extended timeline that Italy remains neutral, Italy would manage to prepare their armed forces a little bit more. Would this be enough to make a big difference? Well, not in the slightest, but at least the Italians would be maybe a little bit more successful. The Battle of Britain would go about the same way as historically, with slightly more damage done to the Germans due to the larger influx of Polish pilots present there. Around September, Operation Sea Lion would be cancelled and the map would look like this. But rewriting history, this is boring. The only thing that is different with this map is that Germany now owns Bialystok and everything is basically the same, but delayed by like 3 months. This isn't alternate history, this is just regular history. I want a refund. And to this I would say that you're very wrong. Despite the fact that this looks like our history, there are a few major differences. First off, Germany is more battered and bruised, taking more damage in every single operation that they have concluded in our own history. Second, they are just starting to recover from their steel shortage, which would have slowed down the German production of raw material anywhere from 2 months to almost a year. Now, I still think that by the time of the 30th of November 1939 rolls around, that the Soviet Union would still invade Finland, and it would result in about the same ending, but this would also be used by the Soviets to learn and prepare for the German invasion. Technically, there is a possibility for the Allies to support Finland and occupy the parts of northern Sweden that were producing iron, as now Germany is worse off and wouldn't be able to resist them, but I will not cover this in this video. Next up, Germany's consolidation of the Balkans would look similar. Hungary and Bulgaria would join the Axis like historically, soon followed by Romania. Italy would take this time to invade Greece in January to March of 1941, which would go as historically, which is to say that it would be suboptimal. Hitler would now have to accelerate his plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union, but would be logistically strained as he is forced to divert more resources down south as to aid the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece. These alternate invasions could possibly see nations like Bulgaria and Hungary to do much more of the heavy lifting, allowing for slightly bigger pieces of Yugoslavia to be given to them. Croatia would also revolt and would be given the same borders as historically. Germany would still annex Slovenia, but possibly allow Italy or Bulgaria to manage the puppet in Serbia instead, as the Reich wouldn't have the forces needed to manage it. I think that Italy would take control of it, installing another member of the Italian royal family in the Serbian throne, similarly to how they did this in Albania. Greece would be a different story. The invasion would go about the same as historically, but Germany wouldn't do their invasion of Crete. This is due to how difficult the invasion was historically, and now with the lack of German supplies to be diverted to this operation, as Hitler ordered his generals to prepare for an invasion of the Soviet Union, I think that Crete may never fall to the Axis. This would later allow the Allies to have a landing spot in Greece and in turn southeastern Europe, if they so wished, along with the ability to bomb the important Axis military facilities in the region. This one is especially important, as the Allies can now bomb the Romanian oil fields, from where the Germans relied heavily for their oil. If this is the case, then the plans to invade the Soviet Union would be even more rushed. The occupation of Greece would be altered as well, with the Germans only occupying Athens and other smaller territories, like a few Aegean islands, possibly allowing Bulgaria to annex more of Thrace and Macedonia directly. Wow, Bulgaria taking even more land. Surely I'm really biased towards them, I wonder why. Jokes aside, I have a simple ask to make. If you have ever enjoyed any of my videos, consider subscribing to the channel, so I can continue feeding you Bulgarian propaganda. Sorry, I meant to say great content. Now back to the video. Taking a look down south, North Africa is also vitally changed. Rome would still be sent there, but German troops would be much more scarce. Not only that, but Polish forces would be sent there as well, but on the opposite side. Overall, the Allies are in a much better situation there than historically. I still expect Romeo to push and do the same earlier offenses. In June of 1949, it's likely about now that the Reich's invasion of the Soviet Union would go underway. This alternate invasion would be a disaster. Not only is this invasion put together way too quickly, but it's constantly being sabotaged by a larger Polish resistance movement, and the Romanian oil wells would be bombed beyond repair. The Soviets are also much more ready for this invasion, preparing for it since 1939. Now still, the Soviet military would be a collection of unaddressed issues at this point, and they would still lose a lot of ground, but the Reich would fail to make a broad front line of territory like in our own history, instead switching towards a spearhead towards Moscow strategy. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk would still be captured, but it would be much smaller and more bloodier than historically for the Germans. But why would Germany push for Moscow instead of Stalingrad and the Caucasus, if they are in a more dire position in terms of oil? Well, I think that the answer would be desperation. Germany couldn't take the Caucasus even with their improved situation in our own history. Perhaps the army command realizes that this would be impossible. Even if they pull a miracle, the Allies would still destroy the Caucasus oil fields. As such, I think that Germany would dash towards Moscow and tries to force a limited peace treaty, where the Soviet Union would give them oil, while Germany would continue their war with the West. This spearhead would stall as it would reach Moscow, never really threatening the city past a handful of bombardments and long-distance artillery strikes. The Soviet counterattack would start soon after that, around mid-December 1941. On a side note, with Germany doing worse, Finland probably wouldn't launch their continuation war just to be safe. This would be a big deal, as then the siege of Leningrad would be much more less effective for the Germans, so not only it doesn't fall, but the Soviets would be much better off. Now back to North Africa, Operation Crusader would be much more successful, freeing the city of Tobruk, while Rommel flees to the city of El Agililua by December, much earlier than historically. Now back to the Eastern Front. While researching the Poles' involvement in the Second World War, I discovered something interesting. The Soviet Union gathered their own portion of the Polish armed forces and formed their own brigade, named Anders Army. With increased Polish-Soviet cooperation in this history, I think it would become a lot stronger. These troops would be placed in Latvia, as close as possible to the Polish mainland, hopefully being the ones to recapture Warsaw. Now let me tell you something cool about the Anders Army, which is that the famous Wojtek bear found in the Second World War was part of this army corps. Pretty cool, right? Now this bear would be fighting for the Soviet Union for a lot longer. German forces would be undersupplied, much more overextended than historically, allowing for an easy counterattack by the Soviets in early 1942. Smolensk would be recaptured and the Red Army would enter Belarus, taking Gumel. Perhaps the turning point here would be the Battle of Smolensk, rather than the one of Stalingrad, which would just go to show that Germany wouldn't push so deeply into the Soviet Union here. These attacks would be paused for a few weeks, as most likely they would have advanced faster than their supply lines. Going back to North Africa, the Americans would be convinced to execute Operation Torch sooner. While this attack would be smaller due to the lack of prepared troops, it would do even much more damage, as Rome wouldn't have the forces needed to occupy these territories. By the end of 1942, the Axis would be forced out of North Africa, with Rommel escaping to Italy and then getting shipped to the Eastern Front. By the way, I don't think that we would see anything different in Asia, with Poland holding out for 4 months longer. Sure, French Indochina would be taken a few months later by the Japanese, due to the French surrendering a bit later, but Japan would still eventually be embargoed, just about 2 to 3 months later, so not a drastic change for them. In all fairness, the Japanese would be doing ever so slightly better, but by far not to win the war in the Pacific or against China. By the end of 1942, Germany wouldn't be looking too good. They would have managed to contain the Red Army, at least for now. American, British, Free French and Polish divisions would now have unrestricted access to the Mediterranean Sea, as the Axis would be kicked out of North Africa. By now, however, everybody knows where the next invasion of them would be, and this would be in Italy, or would it? After North Africa would fall to the Allies, every single person on Earth would know that the Allies wanted to take Sicily. Even the Germans knew it, and they didn't need to spy on the British to know it. This is because it makes total sense. Italy was the weakest in Germany's alliance, and Sicily is right across the sea from Tunis and Malta. Further, when Sicily is taken, the Allies could station airplanes there, and they can bomb vital Italian cities like Naples and Rome, so Sicily would be the obvious target for them. Historically, the British had to go such extreme lengths to convince the Germans that they wouldn't be landing there, and the British ended up creating a whole new person, dumped him into the ocean hiding classified documents. Of course, after the Spanish found about it, it somehow got lost before it could get to Germany. Then it was found again, sent to Germany who inspected all of these classified documents, and then returned the body and the documents back to Britain. This is actually very interesting, and if given the chance you should check it out. It's creatively named Operation Mincemeat. However, now the Germans think that Sicily would be the next target, when in all reality the Allies would most likely use Crete as an invasion point into Greece, which Churchill originally wanted. Basically, the difference here is that in our own history, the British wanted to fool Germany away from Italy and proceed to land in Sicily, while in this alternate history, the British would want to fool the Germans to defend Italy and leave Greece underdefended. While this wouldn't be as good of a landing spot as Sicily, the Axis wouldn't expect it at all, so it would be a perfect landing spot ironically. After the Allies capture Athens and restore the Greek government in exile, the Allied forces would push outwards with little resistance. At this point, Germany would panic and scrape together an army to hold them back, while the German army in Italy would be transitioned there. These would be majority Croatian and Bulgarian troops, with occasional Italians and Romanians. Needless to say that this army would fall apart. As the Allies approach the city of Thessaloniki, it's very likely that Bulgaria decides to bite the bullet and surrender to the Allies, effectively switching sides. This would lead to a total collapse of the Italian lines in Macedonia and then in Albania, with Yugoslavia being restored in Macedonia. The Italian puppet in Serbia would be overthrown, followed by the one in Montenegro. The Soviets would use this time as a chance to continue their push, retaking the Baltics and entering what used to be Poland. As 1943 would drag on, Romania would switch sides as well, as it's surrounded by the Allies and the Soviet Union. I wouldn't be surprised if an invasion of Sicily also takes place, as the Axis armies would be too scrambled in the peninsula, so it would be lightly defended. The Italian Civil War would kick off as a result of that, so Germany would need to install an Italian puppet government to the north. A similar situation could occur in Hungary and Croatia, with Germany wanting to keep their allies in the war. In the latter half of 1943, the Americans would launch D-Day, also known as the Normandy Landings, and it would be very successful. This alternate D-Day would have been more American-led, as the British would be busy in Italy and the Balkans. I would still, however, for funsies, have one beach be a Polish landing, as I think it would be very cool. By now the Axis armies would be fully scrambled, lost and overall overwhelmed. The Americans, French and Poles would advance through France, sweeping up the Germans like historically. Italy would keep losing ground to the Allies, and Hungary would be slowly eaten by the Soviet Union. By this point, Poland would get mostly freed by the Soviet troops, and Germany would get pushed into a corner with every passing day. Soon after, the Allies would enter the Rhineland, Budapest would be captured and Hungary would have surrendered. The Red Army would keep going west and get closer and closer to Berlin. Czechoslovakia would eventually be re-established, however with a lot of Soviet influence. Around mid-1944, the Axis powers would have obviously lost, however Hitler being a madman would demand that his armies continue. The rest of the conflict would go as historically, but there is likely not a Battle of the Bulge, due to less Axis troops being able to be diverted there. The Soviet Union likely captures much more of Germany, as they would have been in a much more stronger position. Without dragging it any longer, the peace treaty would be much more different than historically. First up, Poland may be slightly bigger as a thank you for doing so well against the Germans, but it would be a very minor expansion. The Soviet Union isn't known for being so nice to their puppet states, but what they are known for is for being very hostile to the Germans after the Second World War, so it's possible that Poland expands even a bit more there as well. East Germany is also slightly bigger, as the Soviets would have a much more better position than historically. Bulgaria and Yugoslavia would be much more Western aligned, as they were freed by the Western powers. Other than that, Romania, Hungary, Poland, East Germany and Czechoslovakia would still remain Soviet client states. The thing is that for Poland it's harder to say. The Red Army currently would occupy the country and most likely establish another client state there, but the Polish government in exile is also much more recognized and strong there, so the chances of them being reinstated aren't too impossible with more diplomatic pressure. Now, I hadn't covered the Warsaw Uprising, but I think it wouldn't really matter. This is because Anders' army, which let me remind you was Polish forces led by the Soviet Union, most likely would get sent there to liberate Poland, where they would have the highest morale, so perhaps the Polish revolutionaries would join the Anders' army, instead of kind of fighting a civil war amongst each other. In the end, Europe looks something like this, with a weaker Iron Curtain and a stronger West. The Second World War in Europe would end in around late 1944, but Japan most likely still isn't defeated around the same time as historically, maybe a few months or weeks sooner. Now check out this video regarding Poland joining the Axis if you want something much more different than this. I wish you the best day possible and goodbye.